Course yard 4467, wind 200 at 10, runway 31 left at Kilo Echo, clear for takeoff.
In September 1907, the Cunard Line's Lusitania completed her maiden voyage, marking the beginning of Cunard's potential domination of the North Atlantic. The Lusitania could cross the Atlantic in just 5 days, while her passengers enjoyed the relative luxury of the largest ship in the world. Lusitania's near sister, Mauretania, was under construction and was not far behind. Soon after Mauretania would come a third ship, the Aquitania, and then Cunard would have a premium 3-ship express service between Liverpool and New York. Cunard was the frontrunner on the North Atlantic, but the famously ambitious White Star Line was eager to catch up. Since 1870, with the construction of the first Oceanic, every ship built for the White Star Line, with the exception of the first Traffic, was built by Harland and Wolff. So, when Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line and son of its founder, decided that his company would need to order a trio of ships to rival the developing triad of Cunard ships, he immediately met with Lord Peary, chairman of Harland and Wolff. In the summer of 1907, Ismay and his wife joined Lord Peary at his home for dinner. They talked about Lusitania and Mauretania, and what their partnered companies could do to compete. They quickly decided that their ship's competitive edge would be size. Any attempt to compete with Cunard's ships on speed would be expensive and result in a draw at best. A wider ship meant that it would be slower, but also that it would be less prone to rolling and more spacious to allow for luxurious accommodations. A larger ship would also allow White Star to take advantage of greater economies of scale. In other words, profitability per passenger would theoretically be higher on the larger White Star Line ships than the smaller Cunard Line ships, all else being equal. And at that dinner meeting, a gentleman's agreement was formed. Peary's Harland and Wolff would build 3 ships for Ismay's White Star Line. The first of these ships would be far and away the largest in the world, with each of her 2 younger sisters improving upon the first. Designers went to work, and the keel of the first ship was laid down a year and a half later in December 1908. But White Star still had one major decision to make. What type of propulsion system would be used to power the ship? Cunard's Lusitania and Mauretania were powered by revolutionary turbine engines. White Star's focus was on size and cost, so a ship fully powered by turbine engines was out of the question. There was potential, though, for improved efficiency and lower costs by re-evaluating the traditional triple expansion engine arrangement. Luck would have it that Harland and Wolff had been building 2 identical sister ships for the Dominion Line. These ships were the Albany and the Alberta. The Dominion Line, like the White Star Line, was owned by the International Mercantile Marine Company. So, White Star, which was the flagship line of the IMMC, took the opportunity to enlist the 2 ships for an experiment. The 2 ships were renamed Megantic and Laurentic, respectively. More importantly, Megantic was fitted with traditional triple expansion engines powering 2 propellers, while her sister Laurentic was also fitted with triple expansion engines powering 2 propellers, but also a turbine engine powering a 3rd central propeller. Once delivered, both ships were placed on the Liverpool to Canada route and pitted against each other. And by June 1909, it was clear that not only could Laurentic achieve higher speeds than her sister, but she could do so more efficiently and at a lower cost. So it was decided. The White Star Line's new giant ships would be powered by 2 triple expansion engines and a single turbine engine to maximize efficiency and minimize cost. 3.5 months after the construction of the first ship began, that of the second ship began immediately beside her sister. Finally, in October 1910, after nearly 2 years of construction, Olympic, the first of the White Star's giant steamships, was launched. The size of the ship was breathtaking to the spectators who watched the launch. It was clear that this ship was the biggest in the world. It had to be, and in fact, it would be. But the work was not done yet. Olympic was, in that moment, just a shell, and an incomplete one at that. For the next 7 months, Olympic went through the fitting out process. When she was finally complete, Olympic came in at 46,000 gross registered tons. She was far and away the largest ship in the world, surpassing Mauretania by almost 50%. Despite being a public spectacle, Olympic was only half full when she sailed from Southampton on her maiden voyage on Wednesday, June 14, 1911. 1 week later, on Wednesday, June 21st, Olympic arrived in New York after a comfortable and uneventful crossing. There was no speed record to speak of, and the voyage took a bit longer than it would have aboard one of the premier Cunard liners, but Olympic's passengers enjoyed seemingly endless space, plentiful amenities, and novel luxuries along the way. One day in September 1911, after a smooth inaugural summer season, Olympic was departing Southampton on her 5th voyage. Under the command of a harbor pilot, she was cruising down the Solent with 1,300 passengers on her way to pick up another 800 in Cherbourg and Queenstown. The weather was fine with a moderate breeze, and to exit the Solent and head for Cherbourg, Olympic had to execute a complicated S-turn. Under the command of harbor pilot George Bower, Olympic sounded her whistles to announce the maneuver. Once the turn was complete, Olympic's turbine engine, which powered the central propeller and was not used during the turn, was reactivated and the ship began accelerating toward a speed of 20 knots. By now, the naval cruiser HMS Hawke, which had been traveling eastward up the Solent, was practically running parallel to Olympic. Captain Edward Smith aboard the Olympic was observing Hawke from the starboard bridge wing. By then, Hawke's bow was even with Olympic's bridge, and seemed to have been overtaking the liner, giving Olympic the right of way. Suddenly, the Hawke's bow veered to port. The Hawke's commander ordered the cruiser hard to port, which, in terms of tiller commands, meant to turn the ship to starboard. But the Hawke turned in the wrong direction. In an attempt to correct, the crew realized that the steering gear was jammed. The commander ordered the engines to be stopped, but it was too late. The Hawke's bow sliced into Olympic's quarter. Olympic's watertight doors were quickly shut, and only 2 watertight compartments were flooded. The passengers occupying the cabins where the Hawke struck the liner were enjoying the public spaces of the ship at the time, and remarkably, there were no injuries. With the efforts of the crew and pumps, the HMS Hawke was saved from sinking too. But Olympic was unable to continue her voyage, and had to return to Southampton. Her passengers would have to find another ship to take them across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, White Star Line had a heavily damaged ship to fix, and every day that was spent repairing her cost money and resulted in lost revenue. Ultimately, Olympic would not return to service for 6 expensive weeks. As to who was at fault for the accident, well, the court ruled in favor of the Navy, and placed blame entirely on the Olympic. The argument was that the abrupt turning of the Olympic, combined with the large amount of water she displaced, sucked the Hawke into her wake. If the Olympic had already completed her complicated maneuver though, and was building speed on a steady course, and the Hawke, which had been traveling at a consistent speed, was overtaking the Olympic, then the Hawke would have been obliged to steer clear of the liner. Perhaps though, the Hawke could not have steered clear, due to the reasons previously stated. The events surrounding Titanic's departure from Southampton 7 months later, in which Titanic's suction seems to have caused the liner SS New York to break free from her mooring and nearly collide with Titanic, might be validation for the Royal Navy's claim about the dangers of such large ships operating in close quarters with smaller ships. Olympic's costly repairs delayed her sister Titanic's maiden voyage. When Titanic did sail in April 1912, White Star officially had a major 2-ship service between England and New York. Of course, White Star's newest liner was immediately lost, bringing a monumental loss of life and a devastating financial blow. Olympic was, once again, without a proper running mate on the Atlantic. She would have to wait for the completion of her second sister, Britannic, before her full potential as a transatlantic liner could be unlocked. Further, the loss of Titanic did not inspire great confidence in White Star Line or transoceanic shipping in general. Olympic was traveling eastbound toward Europe when Titanic went down, and when her crew learned the full story of the disaster upon arrival in Southampton, White Star came to realize that Olympic's schedule too would be thrown off. The Gang of Black, the crew who worked in the boiler rooms, refused to sail. The lifeboats, they said, were insufficient and in unacceptable condition, and they knew that, as crew of the boiler and engine rooms, they were among the least likely to survive in the event of a sinking. After all, only a fifth of their counterparts were saved from Titanic. White Star management tried to calm the men down, but when the crew still refused, White Star then threatened the men with charges of mutiny. The resentment among the crew was tangible. One of Olympic's leading firemen reportedly said, "Personally, I do not care, as I am unmarried, but many of the men have wives and families, and their lives are as valuable as those of the first-class passengers." White Star instead rounded up a crew of stokers from Portsmouth, but the striking crew of Olympic refused to let them board. The White Star Line was at a loss, and was forced to cancel the scheduled crossing. When the ship returned to Southampton, 54 crew members were arrested and charged with mutiny. The court decided that the men were guilty, but no fines or punishments were ordered, as public opinion in the wake of the Titanic disaster was in favor of the crew and against the White Star Line. Eventually, Olympic, like all ocean liners, was equipped with additional lifeboats and safety equipment, and Olympic resumed her normal operations for 2 years. Britannic was nearing completion. Then, World War I broke out. White Star's flagship was finishing a westbound crossing in August 1914, when she received wireless messages informing her crew of Britain's imminent declaration of war against Germany, and she, like all other British merchant ships, was directed to dim her lights and immediately find refuge in a neutral or friendly port. Olympic completed 3 more transatlantic crossings, returning citizens abroad to their home countries, before being called in for troop service by the British Admiralty. The ship arrived at Harland and Wolff in October, where she underwent a 10-month conversion. In September 1915, Olympic, armed with a 4.7-inch gun at the bow and a 3-inch gun at the stern, went to work in her new role. Ship 2810 was tasked with carrying 6,000 troops to the Mediterranean to support the Gallipoli campaign. The mission was carried out over 4 voyages. Then the Canadian government requested the use of Olympic to transport Canadian troops to Europe to assist in the war. The port of Halifax, where Canadian troops congregated to ship to Europe, was not ready to support a ship the size of Olympic. The ship required immense amounts of coal to cross the Atlantic, and there were not enough workers or equipment to efficiently fill the bunkers. When the 3,000 tons of coal were sourced, it took 6 days instead of the scheduled 3 days to coal the ship for the first trip from Halifax to Europe, all while troops were on board being exposed to the harmful coal dust. Despite the obstacles, Olympic departed Halifax in early April 1916, on the first of many voyages between Halifax and Europe. Olympic tended to be fully loaded during her time as a troop ship, with men sleeping everywhere, including in hammocks hung in the first-class dining saloon. While on board, the troops were fed the equivalent of third-class meals. It was hearty and probably better than what they were used to. But the journey across the Atlantic was anything but a pleasant and peaceful transatlantic crossing. Even merchant ships were routinely sent to the bottom of the ocean by German U-boats, and Olympic, filled to the brim with 6,000 military personnel, was a prime and legitimate target for the Germans. The Admiralty had originally planned for Olympic to sail as part of a convoy escorted across the Atlantic from Halifax, but Captain Bertram Hayes successfully argued that the ship would be safer steaming at full speed rather than being bogged down by a slow convoy. So, Olympic crossed the Atlantic alone. And it was a harrowing journey. Olympic always departed Halifax under the cover of night. For the first 100 miles, she would sail a strict zigzag course to throw off enemy U-boats. All lights, including navigation lights, were left off. Below decks, lights could only be used if portholes were covered. The passengers were even restricted from smoking at night to avoid the possibility of the soft orange glow at the end of the cigarette from revealing the ship to prowling submarines. Upon arriving at Liverpool, the troops would disembark and get on trains to make the final journey to their assigned locations. On the return trips across the Atlantic, Olympic took on wounded soldiers forced to return home. While Olympic was serving as a troop transport ship, her second younger sister, Britannic, had been completed and immediately converted into a hospital ship. Toward the end of Olympic's first year carrying troops from Halifax, Britannic struck a mine on her way to pick up wounded soldiers from Mudros. Britannic sank with the miraculously low but still tragic death toll of 30. If Olympic was to make it out of World War I, she would return to commercial service without a sister, and it was likely to continue to lack a proper running mate on the Atlantic run. But that concern was secondary. First, she had to survive the war. In January 1917, Olympic was temporarily pulled from service to undergo some modifications, including the installation of more powerful 6-inch guns, and returned to Halifax as His Majesty's troopship, HMT Olympic. And when she returned, pressure from the Canadians to provide Olympic with an escort continued to be resisted. Captain Hayes insisted that the ship was safer, unhindered by an escort, and that the British Admiralty would send destroyers to escort Olympic into port as she approached coastal waters. Olympic continued her service for the rest of 1917. In December, she narrowly avoided the catastrophic Halifax explosion, having departed the city eastward just 5 days earlier. Had Olympic been in the city at the time, she likely would have been a total loss, not to mention the extra thousands of people who would have been in the port in the process of embarking. Without Olympic, North America's further contribution to the war would have been greatly diminished. After all, the citizens of Halifax nicknamed Olympic Old Reliable, and they did in fact rely on her. The United States had joined the war in 1917, but severely lacked the ships to send troops to Europe. So, on Christmas 1917, Olympic arrived in New York, and on January 12, 1918, departed with her first complement of American troops. 3 months later, in April 1918, Olympic was westbound, headed for New York, when she was attacked by a German U-boat. By some miracle, the torpedo which struck her was a dud, and Olympic escaped by the skin of her teeth. On the return voyage from New York, Olympic was entering the English Channel when she spotted an enemy submarine. She acted quickly, turning sharply to starboard and ramming the U-103, sinking her. Olympic exacted her revenge. World War I finally ended on November 11, 1918. Olympic immediately went to work, bringing Canadian troops home. After the first of these voyages from Southampton to Halifax, she was returned to her civilian colors and resumed flying the Red Ensign, signifying Olympic as a British merchant ship once again. During her 3.5 years as a troopship, Olympic had carried 132,000 Canadian and American troops to war and brought 58,000 Canadians back home. This grueling work had taken its toll on the ship, and she returned to Harland and Wolff for an overhaul in August 1919. Having served with honor, Olympic finally returned to the role she was built for as a commercial passenger liner. For the next 15 years, Olympic would enjoy the longest period of uninterrupted commercial operations she would see. Much of Olympic's remaining career would be successful, but by the late 1920s, she was declining in popularity and thus carrying fewer passengers. The onset of the Great Depression only exacerbated Olympic's decline. Much of Olympic's glory years were spent in wartime service, and it was not long before she was simply outclassed by the likes of Majestic, Berengaria, Bremen, and Europa, among others. Efforts to keep Olympic in style included painting the famous grand staircase and other woodwork green in 1933. But Olympic was fundamentally old-fashioned, and insufficient amenities such as a severe lack of private bathrooms gave the ship an expiration date. In the early morning hours of May 15, 1934, Olympic was nearing the coast of the United States, carrying only 158 passengers. Like many previous approaches to New York City, this one was shrouded in thick fog. In fact, most of that particular voyage had been plagued with fog. Captain John W. Binks was likely exhausted, having been obliged to stand ready on the bridge for most of that slow but perilous voyage. For several minutes, you would have been able to hear the cautionary sounds from the Nantucket Lightship, which marked the southern end of the dangerous waters of the Nantucket Shoals. Suddenly, Olympic's steam whistle burst out. The Nantucket Lightship was 600 yards dead ahead. Olympic stopped her engines, but it was too late. 4 crew members dove off the lightship just before Olympic's knife-edge bow sliced into the anchored lightship, which went straight to the bottom, taking the remaining 7 crew members with her. One of Olympic's lifeboats was already being lowered before the collision even occurred. The surviving crew of the stricken lightship was quickly taken aboard. As many ships had always done, Olympic had been aiming directly for the lightship with the intention of turning away as she got close. This common, yet flawed navigational tactic finally resulted in a serious accident. The White Star Line merged with Cunard in 1934, and within 2 years, Olympic, along with many other White Star ships, was deemed redundant, outdated, and not viable given the continued effects of the Great Depression. Olympic's furnishings and fittings were auctioned off, and then Olympic herself was sold for scrap. But Cunard White Star met the moment appropriately. Olympic, a beloved ship full of memories and historical significance, was given a proper send-off. Her former captain, John Binks, since retired, was brought back to sail the Olympic to the breakers, her final resting place.